Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. This is Breeze Toys. My name is Stephanie Bree, and I'm doing another topic. Not because I'm running out of toys to do, because like I said, I have over 300 figures sitting in a tote I haven't even brought in from my van. They're outside. But I wanted to slow down a little bit on the toy reviews and do more topics. And so today's topic is what is up with fantasy and medieval action figures. I'm a fan of fantasy and medieval stuff, but there's not a lot of quality fantasy or medieval action figures out there. The closest you're going to get is a handful of Lord of the Rings, if you count Harry Potter, which I don't, and the LJN Dungeons and Dragons stuff, and the subsequent Super 7 and NECA, etc. Reinterpretations of the LJN Dungeons and Dragons stuff. As far as actual medieval, like knights and kings and barons and fantasy dragons and goblins and orcs and minotaurs, etc., there's just really not a lot out there. Now, you can get miniatures of any fantasy creature you're looking for, but this is largely in part due to the fact that Dungeons and Dragons, the TSR slash Wizards of the Coast Hasbro fantasy role playing game, uses miniatures in its gameplay, as well as Warhammer 40K and a handful of other tabletop miniature war games. But you can't get articulated action figures of these very easily. I had to scour eBay for months to find an acceptable action figure of just a generic medieval knight. Just your plain Jane knight. Oh, I can find statues all day long, Funko Pops all day long. I can get miniature figures all day long, but actual plastic 3 3/4 inch or 5 5 inch, 6 inch scale action figures with articulation, holy Christ, next to impossible. Especially if you're looking for something that isn't really childish looking and cartoony like the Play School stuff. Which I was tempted to buy some of the Play School stuff just because it was like all I could find. But I don't collect Play School stuff. So um, occasionally you can find a generic fantasy or medieval toy line made by some random know nothing, no name company, usually knockoffs of other toys. And I know what you're thinking. You're already screaming at the monitor, but there's Masters of the Universe. That's a fantasy themed toy line. Yes and no. That's a sci fi fantasy toy line. But I'm talking like, yeah, you got Conan the Barbarian, but the toys are based on the cartoon, Conan the Adventurer. And again, you can get Conan, but it's not a generic barbarian. It's just Conan, which is a barbarian, but he's a specific barbarian based on a TV show or a movie. In this case, a cartoon. So there are some out there. There's just not as many as you'd like. There's not like a GI Joe of fantasy. There's no GI Joe equivalent. There's no toy line on the level of GI Joe that's just fantasy medieval figures. So there's like no European soldiers. There's no knights. There's no archers. There's no orcs or goblins or goblin kings or ogre mage or minotaur or you know generic vampire. Even just a generic vampire is hard to find. Generic like zombie, like D&D zombie is hard to find. And some of your fantasy creatures like dragons, you can find pewter statues of dragons all day long. You can find PVC action or PVC figurines all day long. But actual articulated posable dragons, hard as fuck. Now you can find articulated sort of posable dinosaurs. And yes, dinosaurs are monsters within Dungeons and Dragons, and they are kind of sort of fantasy, kind of sort of. but they're not really what I'm looking for, you know. And I know I'm not gonna find an action figure of a Beholder, but to be fair, it's an eyeball. There's no need for articulation. So as far as the Beholder goes, yeah, I'm fine with getting a PVC mini or a metal mini or something like that because it's going to do the job. It is if it's a good quality. But like, I want a fantasy fighter, you know, chest plate, maybe a helmet, a shield, a sword, boots. I want your generic knight, and I don't want the. I do own the Scooby Doo knight, but that's not the knight I want. I don't want a Hanna-Barbera knight. I want a knight that looks like a really cool action figure. And the closest I could find was Lord of the Rings, which was. Lord of the Rings is fantasy, don't get me wrong. But again, it's very specific. It's just Lord of the Rings. So you can get orcs, you can get elves, you can get halflings and dwarves, but it's of specific characters, not just generic of any of those. But again, I don't think they make the treants, and there aren't really a lot of fantasy creatures in the Lord of the Rings. Again, outside the orcs, which I've already said a bajillion times. What else is there? Well, there's not a lot in Lord of the Rings. Now, He-Man does have some barbarian-esque figures and some soldiers that are kind of reminiscent of fantasy creatures. And the Dungeons and Dragons toys, again, do exist, but they're very specific characters. You have the elf from the cartoon, you have the dwarf from the cartoon, the wizard from the cartoon. Again, they look very cartoon in nature. There's just not a lot else out there. There's no like action figure line of, King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. There's no good solid 6-inch scale, 3 3/4 inch scale, articulated with accessories and maybe play sets of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, which would give you some knights, a good variety of knights, maybe some horses, and at best Merlin the Wizard. You're not going to really get a whole lot of fairy tale monsters that way either. So how do you get fantasy-themed action figures that aren't just Lord of the Rings or generic, minis and statues? And I don't know. I don't know the answer to this question. It seems like sci-fi is way overrepresented in the action figure market. Military is way overrepresented in the military market. Pirates, cowboys, Native Americans, those are fairly well represented. Soldiers of all kinds are fairly well represented. But medieval fantasy creatures and soldiers and things of the sort just don't exist really in the action figure market. And that's befuddling to me. Yes, I do want some Lord of the Rings figures. Yes, I do want some Conan the Barbarian figures. If they exist and I can find them, I wouldn't be opposed to buying some, King Arthur and Knights of the Round Table figures. I've even looked at Skeleton Warriors figures to try to get some generic skeleton figures, and the Skeleton Warriors figures look too Ninja Turtles-esque for me. They don't really look like the generic skeleton with a little round shield in his left hand, the rusty sword in his right hand, the horn helmet on his head, and he's going to charge at you in the first level of the dungeon in your campaign. They just don't make action figures of that. And I don't understand why they don't. Now, I am not necessarily categorically opposed to buying D&D action figures, the LJN ones, or modern representations of the LJN ones. But again, those are too specific, too cartoony for me. They're not just generic enough for what I want. Now, if I just want generic World War II soldiers, I can get those all day long. Vietnam soldiers, I can get those all day long, you know? But like just knights and European, medieval archers and things of that sort, can't find them. And I don't understand why. I don't even know. Maybe there is a very specific toy line that sells what I'm looking for, and I just don't know what it's called. So maybe you, viewer, do know what it's called, and you can leave a comment and let me know. That'd be nice. Because when I try Google, I don't get very far because I know generic fantasy and medieval is very generic, and I'm not necessarily looking for just generic. I wouldn't be opposed to like a movie or cartoon based toy line as long as it doesn't look too cartoony and it isn't just like Kevin Costner, like the what's it called, Robin Hood Prince of Thieves toy line, which is kind of medieval, and I might have to dig into that toy line just to get something. As of right now, I'm just looking at Lord of the Rings, but like, where am I going to get a Minotaur? You know, where am I going to get a Lich? Where am I going to get a werewolf that isn't the Universal Wolfman? Just a werewolf, a generic werewolf, or a were-rat. Forget it. Were-rat, I'm never going to find a were-rat action figure. And it's just frustrating. It's annoying that with all the specialized action figure lines that are out there, NECA, Super 7, Best Action, McFarlane, etc., etc., etc. Nobody's making generic or D&D themed or D&D-esque. Is there even a Diablo toy line? A Diablo toy line would probably have what I'm looking for. Or an Elder Scrolls toy line would probably have more of what I'm looking for. You know? But I don't want minis. I don't want pewters. I don't want statues. I don't want PVC. I want action figures. Actual action figures. And this is next to impossible when it comes to medieval or fantasy themed stuff. And it's mind boggling, especially considering how astronomically pervasive this imagery is in our culture. I mean, fantasy and RP and role playing and medieval stuff is very popular in pop culture, but there's just next to nothing in terms of action figures, and I don't understand it. It's weird.